get started, I'd like to welcome Laura Breitenfeld, and who's currently up at Mount Holyoke, previously at Wesleyan, and other places before that. And Laura is giving her this is her applicant talk, and very much looking forward to hearing this subject. So, Laura, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. So today I'm going to be talking about quantifying mineral abundances using vibrational spectroscopy with the application to the asteroid Bennu, the planet Mars, and our moon. So before I get started here, I just want to introduce myself a little bit. My name is Laura Breitenfeld. I am a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Astronomy at Mount Holyoke College. My expertise and research interests include studying compositions and surface processes of planets, small bodies, remote sensing of planetary surfaces. I particularly enjoy studying the mineralogy and chemistry of geologic materials using vibrational spectroscopy. And then I also utilize machine learning multivariate analysis models and statistical methods. So a little bit more about my history. I started in planetary science about 10 years ago while at Mount Holyoke College as an undergraduate, working with Professor Darby Dyer, who I'm now working with again. So very full circle. And then after leaving Mount Holyoke, I went to Stony Brook University for my PhD and worked with Professor Tim Glotch and Professor Deanne Rogers. And then in this last year, I've been at Wesleyan University working with Professor Martha Gilmore, getting into the planet Venus, although that's one of the planetary bodies I won't be talking about today. So another thing I wanted to just share before I get into this talk is a passion of mine, educational outreach and inreach. So while at Stony Brook University, I was the former co-leader of Graduates for Education and Outreach. And then in this last year, I've been involved as a mentor with the Here to Observe program and the virtual trips to extreme environments. So I've really been enjoying working on both of those. And then most recently, I've become a member of the Early Career Committee for the Mineralogical Society of America. One of the initiatives I'm starting to work on is establishing student chapters for undergraduate students across the country who are interested in mineralogy. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about methodologies and demonstrate some examples of mineral quantification using vibrational spectroscopy with the application to planetary science. And specifically, I'm going to be primarily talking about mid-infrared spectroscopy and Raman spectroscopy. And so understanding planetary compositions and quantifying those compositions is very useful in making conclusions about solar system materials, processes, and conditions. So the overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'm first going to tell you about a project I worked on in establishing machine learning models using mid-infrared spectroscopy for the prediction of modal mineralogy of Ci and Cm chondrites and the asteroid Bennu. Next, I'm going to be talking a little bit about work that builds on that, including mapping of phyllosilicates on the asteroid Bennu. Then I'll be shifting gears and going into estimating modal mineralogy using Raman spectroscopy. Specifically, I'm going to go into two different methodologies here, including multivariate analysis models, as well as a methodology that we established called Raman cross-section proxies. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on some ongoing and future work, including the characterization of lunar samples using Raman spectroscopy. Okay, so first I'm going to give a little bit of background about the asteroid Bennu, since we're going to be talking about it in quite a bit of detail. So Bennu was the target of the OSIRIS-REx mission. It arrived at the asteroid in 2018, right around the time I was getting involved with the mission. And I worked on studying this asteroid throughout my PhD from 2018 until 2023. So this asteroid is a near-Earth asteroid. It is a B-type asteroid. It is a rubble pile. You can see that there are some really large boulders on the surface of it and no ponds of fine materials. So this made it a lot more difficult to sample the surface of this asteroid. It has an equatorial ridge, which we can see here, and it has a really low albedo. So this is a series of pictures that show the sampling event of this asteroid. And really incredible to see the sample being collected here, and then it has been sent back to Earth and has already been analyzed. So we know that this asteroid is made up of carbonaceous chondritic materials. So this means that these materials contain organic compounds. These kinds of materials also have few to no chondrules present. And this is due to the altered mineralogy from the process of aqueous alteration. So we have anhydrous anhydrate minerals like olivine and pyroxene alterating to hydrated materials like phyllosilicates, clays. And then lastly, these materials have primitive chemical compositions, which make them really interesting to study early solar system processes. Okay, so while working with OSIRIS-REx, I was studying OSIRIS-REx thermal emission spectrometer data. So in black here, we can see the average spectrum of this asteroid. We have a silicate stretching region within this spectrum. We have a small feature that was attributed to magnetite and a larger feature associated with phyllosilicates or clay minerals. So this starts the first project that I studied with the OSIRIS-REx mission. And these models and analysis of this average spectrum of Bennu was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Planets in 2021. So the objectives of this work were to create models to quantify the composition and specifically the mineralogy of this asteroid, and then apply the models to the OTEST data for the prediction of the mineralogy of the average surface of Bennu. So this work relied on a set of physical samples, minerals, to study the pure mineral end members as well as mineral mixtures. So the mineralogy we utilized is consistent with Ci and Cm chondrites, and includes phyllosilicates like magnesium-rich serpentine, kronstatite, saponite, carbonates like calcite and dolomite, olivine minerals, enstatite, which is a pyroxene, and magnetite. So utilizing these end member minerals, we made mineral mixtures that covered a range between 0 volume percent to 100 volume percent, so that predictions could be made for different compositions of different materials. So this is a summary figure that shows what the training set composition consisted of. So the training set had to consider the mineralogy of relevant materials to Bennu. It also considered particle size, so it included both fine and coarse materials. This is important because in the mid-infrared, they have different influences on the spectra, as well as the albedo of the mixtures themselves to be most relevant to this asteroid. So after making this set of mineral mixtures, each of them were analyzed at Stony Brook University using the Planetary and Asteroid regolith spectroscopy environmental chamber, also known as PARSEC. So PARSEC is coupled with an FTIR spectrometer for mid-infrared emission measurements. So each of these samples are placed within the chamber, 6 at a time, and then the chamber is sealed. It is pumped down to 10 to the negative 4 millibars, and then cooled with liquid nitrogen to less than 125 degrees Celsius. And so after these conditions are met, the samples are heated from both below and above to induce a thermal gradient. And this allows us to simulate what measurements are like on an airless body like the asteroid Bennu. So this is a summary slide of 317 unique spectra that were collected for this project and act as the training set to make predictions from. So utilizing these data, we apply a machine learning multivariate analysis modeling technique called partial least squares, or PLS. And this technique utilizes all of the channels within the spectra to make predictions of a given metadata category. In this case, we're interested in predicting composition. This is a summary of the internal model predictions for these models that I constructed. So I constructed 5 models that are shown here. One that's focused on phyllosilicates, olivine, carbonate, pyroxene, and magnetite. And so these graphs we can see have the actual percentage values on the x-axis and predicted values on the y-axis. And we're looking here for a one-to-one relationship. I also did some more robust testing of these models by applying them to meteorite spectra and evaluating the error of their performance. So here we have a summary of the model predictions versus information from the returned sample from this past year. So we're looking at predictions of the phyllosilicates, the carbonates, the olivine. In this case, we're looking at mineralogy in volume percent. So to summarize what I found here is for example, I wasn't able to make a sulfide model. This is because of spectral blandness of sulfides in the mid-infrared. But when we look at other components like pyroxene, we predicted that that pyroxene would not be present on the asteroid, and it in fact was not detected in the quantitative XRD data. We did find from the carbonate and the olivine models that we over-predicted those abundances. But luckily, we did find that the phyllosilicate prediction of 78 volume percent is very aligned with the quantitative XRD data of 80 volume percent from the return sample. So in conclusion, we find that the total phyllosilicate content is consistent between the model and the quantitative XRD data of the return sample. The materials on Bennu experience high degrees of aqueous alteration. And this methodology is useful in predicting mineral abundances with various particle sizes, which is really important in mid-infrared spectroscopy. Okay, so now I'm gonna build upon this project that I just spoke about and talk to you about my work in mapping phyllosilicates on the asteroid. So this work was published in 2022 in Geophysical Research Letters. Okay, so the objectives of this work were to build on the previous work I just presented to you and identify and interpret O-test spectral variability on the surface of the asteroid using this multivariate method. And specifically, I was interested in investigating phyllosilicates across the surface of the asteroid and creating mineral maps. So again, this training set relies on various minerals, but in this case, we're looking at the phyllosilicate minerals specifically on the asteroid. So my model utilized magnesium-rich serpentine, kronstatite, which is an iron-rich serpentine, and saponite, which is a smectite mineral. So we applied the phyllosilicate model to OTEST data sets, including the Equatorial 3 OTEST data set. This data set is collected with a local solar time around noon at a heliocentric distance of 1.2 astronomical units and has roughly 2,400 spectra. I also applied the phyllosilicate model to the baseball diamond 1 data set. This data set has a larger range of local solar times and a heliocentric distance of 1 AU, and more spectra to analyze. So this is a summary of what was found from applying the machine learning multivariate phyllosilicate model to the individual OTEST data rather than an average spectrum. So we predict higher magnesium-rich serpentine compared to the presence of an iron-rich serpentine or smectite mineral. And this magnesium-rich serpentine predictions, their higher values are consistent with magnesium-rich phyllosilicate detections from the returned sample. So another aspect of this was to look into spectral variability. So using the baseball diamond 1 data set, here I've pulled out spectra with the highest prediction of magnesium-rich serpentine and the lowest prediction of magnesium-rich serpentine. Although these spectra look really similar, they are distinct from each other, particularly in the silicate stretching region, as well as with the phyllosilicate feature around 440. So when we look at how these spectra are located across the surface of the asteroid, here we're looking at a mineral map of the asteroid Bennu. So we can see that the spectra with the lower prediction of magnesium-rich serpentine are centered around the equatorial region of the asteroid, whereas those ones with a higher prediction are located in the middle latitudes. The sampling location of Nightingale was not on the equatorial region and was higher in latitudes. So it would be more consistent with a high prediction of this magnesium-rich serpentine. So what does this mean in terms of looking at carbonaceous chondritic materials? So serpentine-rich materials with higher magnesium to iron ratios have a higher degree of aqueous alteration than those with lower magnesium to iron ratios. So from this, we definitely can conclude that the asteroid Bennu experienced really high degrees of aqueous alteration. So in addition to the role of alteration, I also looked at how sorting might be impacting what we're seeing on the surface of the asteroid. So Jowan et al. Studied the mass movement of materials towards the equatorial region of the asteroid Bennu. And this could potentially contribute to the spectral variability that we're seeing between the equatorial region and the middle latitudes of Bennu. So this mass movement, along with observations of differences in thermal inertia across the surface, may have also caused this mineral fractionation through physical processes that results in variations due to crystal size and mineral composition. So in summary, again, this observed OTEST spectral variability between the equatorial region and the middle latitudes of Bennu may be due to sorting effects. Okay, so we've talked about the asteroid Bennu, and now I'm going to shift gears. So I'm going to go into some work that is more applicable to the planet Mars. So I'm going to be talking about estimating modal mineralogy using Raman spectroscopy, and specifically two different techniques. So the first being multivariate analysis, and the second being a technique that we establish called Raman cross-section proxies. This work was recently accepted by American mineralogists. So the objectives of this work were to quantify mineral abundances using machine learning multivariate models through a training set of samples, as well as to accomplish this goal by using proxies for Raman cross-section using a reference material. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about what does this Raman cross-section mean. But we used a reference material here, which was a diamond powder, to accomplish this goal. So this work of quantifying mineral abundances in mixture using Raman spectroscopy is applicable to laboratory analyses as well as terrestrial field work. But my focus is more planetary science based. And so the minerals that I specifically chose to study in this application are relevant to the planet Mars. So as you know, there are some Raman instruments on the surface of Mars on Perseverance, and RLS will be on ExoMars. And these instruments make it important to understand and quantify mineralogy using these techniques. So for this study, we need to think about the spot size of these Raman measurements. So the volume that the laser interrogates for Raman measurements influences what we can observe. So if that beam spot is large enough, we can get spectra with mixed minerals or multiple minerals within that integrated volume. So in the case of RLS and Sherlock, there is a smaller beam size of 50 microns, but a fine grain material in that size could also result in mixed mineral spectra. However, this problem is particularly the case for a larger spot size, like the 1.3 millimeter size of the SuperCam instrument. Okay, so the problem that we're facing here is that it is difficult to quantify minerals in mixture because of nonlinear mixing effects in Raman spectroscopy. So let's talk about this and see an example of this. So Raman cross-section is a term that describes a material's inherent signal strength, and this is controlled by bond polarizability of the mineral structure. So if we look at this example here, we have three mineral mixtures that we're looking at, Raman spectra of those mixtures. And if we look at, for example, the red and the yellow spectra, we see that they both have 20 volume% calcite present. However, when we look at the spectra themselves, if you look to the far right of this diagram, you can see that the calcite signal at 1080 wave numbers has two drastically different signals between these mixtures. So despite both having 20 volume% calcite, their signal strength changes. And this is because of what they are paired with. So the mixture of calcite with forsterite will have a different signal than when calcite is mixed with labradorite. So this can give you a sense of why this is such a difficult problem to address. So there's two solutions that I explored in this work. The first was to quantify mineral abundances using multivariate models through a training set of samples. So this is very similar to what I just explained with my OSIRIS-REx and Bennu projects. Whereas the second solution is to quantify mineral abundances from a proxy for Raman cross-section. And I did this using a reference material. So here we're looking at different proportions of olivine mixed with diamond powder, our reference material. And as you change the proportion of those mixtures, the relative signal strengths vary. So in solution one, we're using pure minerals and binary mineral mixtures to create these multivariate analysis models. Whereas in our second solution, we're using diamond mineral mixtures to evaluate these Raman cross sections. So yeah, let me go into these samples a little bit further. We have 20 pure mineral samples in this study relevant to Mars. This includes 2 oxides, 3 carbonates, 4 sulfates, a nesosilicate, inosilicates, phyllosilicates, and tectosilicates. From these 20 pure minerals, we made 187 mineral-mineral mixtures. And these 187 mineral mixtures were utilized in the multivariate analysis. Whereas we only use these 20 pure minerals to create 20 diamond mineral mixtures used for the Raman cross-section proxy method. So these minerals were each handpicked for purity. They were crushed into fine powders and sieved. The powders were useful to create intimate mineral mixtures, and this allowed particles to be oriented at random positions and reduce the influence of orientation effects in the spectral measurements. Additionally, we did chemical analyses of these pure minerals to understand their compositions and calculate their densities such that the mixtures could be created in known volume percentages. So after creating this large data set of samples to analyze, we made our Raman measurements using Bruker's Bravo handheld spectrometer with 3 sample scans obtained with an integration time of 10 seconds from 300 wave numbers to 3,200 wave numbers. This instrument was particularly useful in making these measurements because it has a large spot size. And this again allows us to evaluate multiple minerals within a single spectrum. Okay, so this is a summary of the Raman spectra of the minerals relevant to Mars that I studied in this project. So this includes oxides, carbonates, sulfates, nesosilicates, inosilicates, phyllosilicates, and tectosilicates. So these are all minerals that we expect on the surface of Mars, and their Raman spectral data is consistent with the literature and previous Raman studies. So using these pure Raman spectra, as well as the Raman spectra of the mineral mixtures, we created the multivariate models. So this is a summary of the performance of the multivariate models. We have actual values on the x-axis and predicted values on the y-axis. And again, here we're looking for a one-to-one relationship between actual and predicted values. Again, here I did do a more robust study into the error of this model, and the reason for this is it's really important to make sure we're not just evaluating the error of data within the model. So we did cross-validated root mean square error values as well. Okay. So now we're going to go into the Raman cross-section proxies in a little bit more detail. So as I previously stated, this is a technique that we established in this paper. So we assigned the Raman cross-section proxy to be equivalent to the area of a diagnostic mineral feature using Raman spectroscopy compared to the area of the reference material, or in this case, the diamond feature, and then multiplied by the percentage of the reference material or the diamond powder. So let's talk about this graph in a little bit more detail, as this gives us a visual representation of these Raman cross-section proxies. So here we're looking at two different mixtures, anhydrite mixed with diamond and forsterite mixed with diamond. And when we normalize this data to the diamond feature on the right side of this diagram, we can see that the relative signal strengths of the anhydrite feature and the diagnostic forsterite feature differ dramatically. So we can see here that because of that anhydrite signal being stronger, we could deduce that the Raman cross-section proxy of the anhydrite mineral is greater than that of the forsterite sample. So following this logic and the equation, we're able to calculate Raman cross-section proxy values for each of the 20 minerals that we analyzed. So the summary of this is that the non-silicate minerals have higher Raman cross-section proxies, typically over a value of 1, whereas the silicate minerals have lower Raman cross-section proxy values, typically under 1. And this is aligned with what we would expect, given the mineral structures between non-silicate and silicate minerals and bond polarizability. So how did these Raman cross-section proxies perform in predicting data outside these models? So unlike the multivariate data, we have a little advantage here where we can use those mineral mixtures or those binary mineral mixtures to evaluate the performance of the Raman cross-section proxy method. So on our x-axis, we have actual values, and our y-axis, we have predicted values. And these are applied to those binary mineral mixtures. And so these data are completely separate from the model itself and allow us to more robustly test their performance. So I wanted to talk through some of the pros and cons between these two different methodologies that I've gone into some detail on. So the Raman cross-section model is a much more efficient model to construct. So given this model, we only need a single sample to create a prediction, whereas for the multivariate analysis model, we must have an entire training set. So it is much more time consuming compared to the Raman cross-section proxy. Additionally, for the same reason, there's a smaller sample requirement for the Raman cross-section proxy method compared to the multivariate analysis method. A downside of the Raman cross-section proxy method is that mineral identification is required. And so this methodology requires a trained Raman spectroscopist, whereas the multivariate method can be applied without as much knowledge of the materials themselves. There's also more flexibility with the Raman cross-section proxy method in encountering materials that are unexpected. So if you are studying materials on a different planet and you encounter or detect a mineral that you weren't expecting to encounter, it's much easier to create a single mixture and then be able to quantify that material. Whereas this is much more difficult with the multivariate analysis method, as many samples would need to be created and analyzed. Downsides of the Raman cross-section proxy method is that there is more of a dependence on paired phases. So which minerals are paired when detected, and overlapping features can also inhibit the Raman cross-section proxy method. When it comes to actually applying these two techniques to data outside the model. They're both very fast applications. Okay, so the conclusions for this part of the talk include we evaluated two different methods for quantifying the geologic materials using Raman spectroscopy. And different scenarios may favor one or the other quantitative method, although their performance was pretty similar. Creating the multivariate models may be more useful if it's more of a specific to geologic units. So in the case of Mars, making these models specific to Mars or Sita might be more useful in reducing the required number of end members, which would result in fewer mineral mixtures that would need to be analyzed, more efficient model construction, and higher accuracy. And then a really important part of this project was we introduced the Raman cross-section proxy method. And we showed that there was a quantitative relationship between the mineral structure and chemistry on the effect of bond polarizability, and in turn, the Raman cross-section proxy. Okay. So I am going to just briefly talk about some of my ongoing and future work related to characterizing lunar samples using Raman spectroscopy. Earlier this year, I submitted a paper that was recently accepted in American Mineralogist that is looking at the Raman spectroscopy of the ilmenite geekolite solid solution. So I'll get into what ilmenite and geekolite is, but this work is definitely applicable to terrestrial work, but it is also useful for lunar applications as we have ilmenite on the moon. So ilmenite is the iron titanium oxide mineral, whereas geekolite is the magnesium titanium oxide mineral. And I characterized samples on the solid solution using Raman spectroscopy. So you can see here those spectra color-coded by their composition, with the geekolite in purple and the ilmenite in yellow. And on the upper right hand of the slide, you can see a relationship between the peak position of the Raman feature centered around 700 wave numbers, and that relationship to that ilmenite percentage or that composition. So we see this clear relationship between the peak position and the ilmenite composition, which can be really useful for determining that ilmenite composition for materials remotely. So this would be useful, again, with lunar samples, but also in a potential future deployment of a Raman spectrometer to the moon. Some other current work I'm doing is collecting Raman spectral measurements of lunar soil samples. So I'm using both the Bruker Bravo handheld spectrometer that I spoke about before for bulk Raman measurements of these lunar samples, as well as a micro Raman spectrometer, which allows us to analyze specific grains of these samples. And here you can even see an example of a lunar glass bead that we looked at. So this is a really exciting future direction for research. Another thing that I'm interested in is looking at analog mixtures of compositions relevant to the moon. So these would be compositions, samples with compositions of feldspar, pyroxene, olivine, and ilmenite. And similar to the work I presented for Mars and the asteroid Bennu, constructing a set of samples and a training set of spectral data could allow for models to be constructed to analyze lunar samples. Okay, so here I just wanted to briefly touch on some directions of research that I would like to go in the next few years. So some of these I've already touched on, but I'll give a little bit more detail. So I definitely am interested in characterizing these lunar samples using Raman spectroscopy and preparing for the potential deployment of a Raman instrument to the moon. I'd also like to re-examine the remote sensing data of the asteroid Bennu and the asteroid Ryugu, given our knowledge from the returned samples of these asteroids. I would also like to take the Raman spectroscopy work that I spoke about today and apply those models to spectra from Mars, and specifically the SuperCam instrument. And then lastly, I'm getting really interested in studying mineral quantification of carbonaceous chondritic meteorites more generally, as well as organic thermometry using Raman spectroscopy. So here I just want to bring up this slide again so we have a memory of what I spoke about today. So I talked about two different projects related to the asteroid Bennu and specifically looking at phyllosilicates. I also talked to you today about two different methodologies for quantifying mineralogy using Raman spectroscopy. And lastly, my ongoing and future work related to lunar samples. So this work that I've presented today has to do with the establishment of methodologies and specific examples of mineral quantification using Raman spectroscopy and mid-infrared spectroscopy with the application to different planetary bodies. And this information related specifically to composition and mineralogy of these planetary bodies inform solar system materials, processes, and conditions, particularly processes like aqueous alteration that dramatically alter and change the mineralogy of those bodies. So I'd like to just quickly acknowledge my co-authors and particularly professors Tim Glotch, Deanne Rogers, and Darby Dyer for their mentorship over the past few years, and thank my funding sources and the OSIRIS-REx mission. So with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm sure there are questions. I've got some, but I'll hold off. Anybody raise their hand or chime in? Okay, well, people are contemplating. I wanted to ask you about the model outcomes. That to what extent are the mineralogies that you come up with dependent upon sensitive to temperature and particle size?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think particularly the mid-infrared, those temperature and those particle size effects make a much bigger difference than the Raman spectroscopy. So that's definitely something to consider. Something I mentioned was like with the mid-infrared, I included both fine particulates and coarse particulates within the model. So that was really important to be able to represent within the model those two different behaviors. I do think that there's a lot more work that could be due to kind of disentangle the effects of composition and particle size, for sure.
Nolan, you had your hand up first.
Yes, actually, my question somewhat related to what Mark asked. You are talking about Bennu and pointed out the mineralogical differences as you go from the equatorial regions to other regions of Bennu. So if you look at the size distribution or the average size of particles, I'm using the particles in a very broad sense here. Is there any difference?
Yeah, there are differences between the particle sizes across the surface of the asteroid, and those do influence the mid-infrared spectroscopy and also the thermal inertia. I think that the work that I did was a little bit more focused on composition, and Vicki Hamilton did a study that was more focused on particle size and looked at these two different end member spectra called a T1, T2 spectra. And I think that there just needs to be more work to disentangle those two factors and really evaluate what is caused by composition and what is caused by particle size. When I made these models, we didn't have any idea what the composition, I mean, we had just a general compositional idea of what the asteroid would be. So I think with the knowledge of the return sample, those two factors could be teased out like much more carefully.
But do you see any correlation between the, say, I think you're talking about magnesium bearing?
Yeah.
And those minerals, as you go from equatorial to further high latitudes, with the particle size, is there any correlation?
Yeah, it's not completely correlated. So if you look at Vicki Hamilton's work and my work, the spectral differences that we pull out are slightly different, and as well as their distributions across the surface of the asteroid. So I think that both of these factors really have an influence here, and yeah, quantifying each of their roles really just needs more work.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Neil.
Yeah, for your machine learning model, do you think the two minerals that were overestimated, was that due to underestimate or not estimating at all the sulfides, or was it inherent to those two minerals themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think my inability to predict the sulfides probably was a contributing factor, although each of those models are independent models. So in theory, they should be able to be predicted more accurately despite the sulfide. But I think maybe considering the training set a little bit further in terms of representation of that sulfide might be an influence there.
Okay, thank you.
John.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, Laura. Thanks for your talk. Appreciate that. I have a question about the, I think it was with reference to the lunar work that you were doing, looking at ilmenite and the magnesium analog of oxide. So two questions. First one is just to clarify for myself, those were just simple binary mixtures of the two only, is that correct?
No, that's a great question. Those are actually synthetic samples that were made. So they're not mixtures between ilmenite and giekellite, but they actually are like representative samples. So you could think of them as being like equivalent to a forsterite and a phaolite. They're inherently those minerals.
Oh, I see. So it's a solid solution. I mean,
it is a solid solution.
Okay, so each analysis is essentially a pure sample of a solid solution then.
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Well, that's all right. So what's interesting about the Raman's results is that as the proportion changed between the two, and not only does it seems like the peaks go up and down in height, but there's also a shift in the Raman wave number. And so it's like it's circling around as it goes from low to high, say ilmenite, for instance. So I'm curious, how are you able to use the shift in Raman wave number as a guide in that? And how do you interpret the fact that the peak heights are not going up linearly?
Yeah, so the fact that the peak heights are not moving linearly gets to that same concept I was talking about which is the Raman cross section of those materials. So each of those end members have a different Raman cross section, and so that's that influence. And then we see that with that other plot I showed, that there is this univariate relationship between composition and the peak position. So that's a really clear relationship. I did actually test in that work a multivariate model. And so that again would look at every channel of the spectrum opposed to just a single unit variable like peak position. So I wasn't able to, I think in that paper, I conclude that it's moving in the right direction, but just because of the number of samples I had, I wasn't able to make a robust enough model from the multivariate data. I think if we had more than, I think there was around 10 samples, that could be a future direction. So then that height difference that you were talking about would be actually really useful for those models.
Okay, so if you had more sample availability, then you could maybe try some replicate analyses of those.
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, that explains it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your question.
Tom.
Hey, Laura, this is Tom Burbine. Someone told me that they thought your model predicted Bennu's composition before sample was returned better than any model. Do you agree with that, or?
I appreciate that, Tom. I don't know if that's I really appreciate that. Yeah, I was really happy with the phyllosilicate prediction. I think 2% difference is really well within the error of that model. I think, you know, it's unfortunate that some of the other models kind of over predicted, but I really appreciate that statement. So thank you.
Okay.
Oh, Dave.
Oh, hi. Really nice talk. One of the problems we have at Gale Crater is that we've got lots of mixed sulfate minerals, often 4 or 5 together at the same time. How would this work with the sulfates?
Yeah, so I guess the question is like, how might this work within a single mineral group? Is that aligned with what you're curious about?
They're mixtures of, we often have all 3 calcium sulfates together, gypsum basanite and anhydrite. And sometimes with a magnesium sulfate, like starkeyite mixed in.
Mhm.
It gets a little dicier than that because most of our samples are about 50% X-ray amorphous, and there's some sulfate in there too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like for that specific problem, you would need to create a different model, but with enough analog sulfate minerals, and then different proportions of those minerals, I think it's a really solvable problem if enough time and effort is put towards you know, characterizing those pure end members, making mixtures, and then analyzing them. I think the quantification is probably very realistic.
Okay, that'd be nice. I'm a real fan of multiple instrument suites. I love XRD, but we need more. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions for Laura? Well, Laura, thank you very much for your talk. It was a great talk, and you know, we'll be in touch. And
Okay.
take care.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.